haul or doing regular seasonal movements that allow for resting in these reserve pastures. And that storage generally decreases vulnerability. So the point I want to make here is that these strategies that I talked about before are interdependent adaptive strategies that in these pastoral systems likely co-evolved, and that things like mobility and storage are really management practices, and that reciprocity and common pooling are supporting institutions that support those. And I'm not going to try to trace through all the lines in this diagram right now, but the point I want to make is that as we thought through all the interrelationships between these practices, diversification, which really represents the assets that households have, we found that reciprocity and exchange were especially important in enabling herders to implement these practices. So you can't be mobile and go unauthored if you don't have strong relationships with your neighbors who will allow you to access their pastures in a time of disaster. And if we had, instead of a commons in Mongolia, if we had private property with fences, that would also limit mobility. So the common pooling and reciprocity support those, that strategy of mobility. So a little bit about adaptive capacity then. It's been defined as the ability to experiment, innovate, learn, and act on new information in response to change and disturbance. So, and in contrast to adaptation, which can sometimes be maladaptive, adaptive capacity generally seems to be viewed in kind of exclusively a positive light. It's not easy to measure, however, just like you'll notice I haven't used the R word, resilience, in this talk, which is very difficult to measure. Adaptive capacity may be slightly easier. Engel in 2011 suggested that to measure adaptive capacity, you need to be able to measure some characteristic of the community before and after an event, and then relate that to indicators that are theorized to increase the community or household's ability to respond to that shock. Agarwal has talked about adaptation, particularly adaptation to climate change, being inherently local. Those events happen in places and people respond in place. And he and others have made the point that institutions are potentially important to people's ability to adapt because they provide incentives, they may facilitate, build capacity, or they can create barriers to adaptation. But the role of local institutions, particularly in building or hindering adaptive capacity, is really poorly understood, and a lot of the adaptation policy is really happening at a more national level and not at the local level. So what we've tried to do in our particular Mongolian rangelands and resilience project is focus on the role of local institutions. And one of our main questions is, do community-based rangeland management institutions increase adaptive capacity of households and communities? So in this case, we're comparing formally organized community-based rangeland management groups, that most of which were formed with some external intervention by donors, with traditional herder communities or neighborhoods. And so for this talk, we'll call these CBRM, the formally organized group, and non-CBRM. And maybe some of you were lucky enough to see Tunga's talk on Monday, where she went into more detail about this. So when we looked at, again, herd losses in this event in households that belong to these formal organizations versus traditional neighborhoods, we actually surveyed the same communities twice, one immediately after the, and then a more detailed survey for our larger project about 1.5 years later. So there were 2 different random samples of the same communities. And in the first one, we found no statistically significant difference in the losses, but in the second one, we found a pretty marked difference. So that may just be, sampling error because it was 2 different random samples. It's a relatively small sample size. But then in our second survey, we were also able to ask a lot more detailed questions about herders' activities. And we focused on 2 sets of behaviors or practices. Ones that are more traditional practices, either from sort of time immemorial or implemented during the collective era from the 50s through until the early 90s. And we called those winter preparedness activities, a set of 13 practices, and the other that we called innovative practices, which are things that herders would be less likely to do traditionally, but might include actually planting fodder crops instead of just harvesting native forage, engaging in environmental monitoring, restoration activities, using fertilizer, using irrigation, things like that. And what we found was that the herders that belonged to these formally organized groups scored significantly higher on both these scales. So they were more likely both to use the beneficial traditional practices and much more likely to use these innovative practices. So they were better prepared for winter and used more of these innovative practices. I don't have time to go in detail through all these, what all the 13 and 21 practices were, but a lot of them did have to do with storage and mobility. So then, though, in terms of adaptive capacity, these are really the behaviors and the practices. What is it about belonging to a formal community-based group that makes it more likely that you will do those things? So we also tried to look at potential kind of explanatory mechanisms or real indicators of, how is it that formally organized groups are creating incentives or encouraging people to do these things. So, and I'm just putting, again, here the items that we found to be significantly associated with this difference between traditional groups and formally organized groups. And those included bridging social capital, so that's their networks and relationships, but not so much with other herders as with government, NGOs, experts, and so forth. That's what is referred to as bridging social capital. Information diversity, so the number of different sources of information they were able to access about things related to pasture and disaster management. Knowledge exchange, which was the number of people that they knew in their community with whom they discussed these topics. And proactiveness was an index of their activities to work together or to proactively contact a government official or an expert. And leadership had to do with their perception of leadership and the trust in their leadership within their community. So the last thing we did then was to look at these two indices as dependent variables and see which of these possible explanatory variables best predicted those in the multiple regression. And it was interesting that it was kind of a different set of variables for the traditional practices versus the innovation practices, except that diversity of information was very important for both of those. And overall, both regressions were significant, but they don't explain a huge amount of the overall variability in the household behavior. So there's definitely more to be done. In terms of institutional barriers to adaptation, this really came out of our discussions and conversations and interviews with herders. There's a lack of legal recognition and rights for most types of formal community-based management groups. There's some exceptions to these, so they don't have any legally recognized rights to manage or possess pasture and exclude non-member herders. Troy, I think, and Dawn will talk later more about mineral development in Mongolia, but an issue that definitely came up was unenforced mining regulations. So the government can lease mineral rights for exploration and exploitation on people's pasture without any input from herders. The unclear and ineffective institutions to regulate cross-border migration. So I want to make clear that I was saying those migrations need to take place. That's a really essential strategy, but it needs to be done in a more coordinated way so that the host communities aren't harmed in the process. And although national rangeland assessment and monitoring capacity is developing, there's currently really no mechanism to tie that back to decision making. And we can see that decision, the observations and the responses get tied back organically at the level of the household, but there's not an institutional structure to do that at a broader spatial and an organizational scale. So just summing up, so herders observe, experience, cope with, and adapt to climate change in this system. Mobility and storage have been traditionally and continue to be key adaptive practices, but those are really dependent on these other institutional strategies: exchange, reciprocity, and common pooling. Mobility and storage, in this case, significantly reduce vulnerability to this kind of disaster. And it appears that formal community-based management can enhance, at least in these cases, adaptive capacity by increasing knowledge exchange, information diversity, networks, and proactiveness. So the policy implications, this is some support for continuing to invest in and support formal community-based resource management in Mongolia and potentially considering scaling it out. But the institutional obstacles, both to adaptation broadly and CBRM specifically, need to be addressed. And we do need to have more rigorous research on the outcomes and causal mechanisms of community-based management and make sure that we look at the potential downsides in terms of participation, equity, and power within the groups. And we still need to continue to move towards a more integrated analysis of system-level adaptive capacity that includes looking at the ecosystem as well as the social attributes and feedbacks that I've mostly focused on today. So thank you very much, and I just want to again acknowledge all the partners, all the fabulous partners in this project as well as our funders. Thanks.